Montana Territory, December 1891. Snow clouds pressed low over the Bitterroot Valley when the most respected builder in the region stepped back from a half-finished structure and shook his head. Thomas Blackwood made sure his voice carried so everyone nearby could hear him. He said it was not a home. He said it was a death trap pretending to be warm. People nodded as they looked at what stood in front of them, confused and doubtful. The building looked nothing like a normal frontier cabin. It was a curved metal shell resting on stone foundations with two chimneys rising from opposite ends. It looked strange, almost wrong against the familiar log homes of the valley. And the person building it was not a trained craftsman or a seasoned contractor. It was a widow named Margaret Hartwell, 42 years old, a woman who had never laid a brick until 6 months earlier. By the time spring arrived, families across the valley would begin copying her design. A few years later, builders across 3 territories would be studying her work. But on that cold November day, no one believed in it, especially not the man who was mocking her. The wind shifted. Thomas Blackwood, 55 years old in 1891, pulled his coat tighter and watched Margaret work. She moved with careful precision, measuring the angle of a stone channel that would run beneath the floor. Her hands were rough from labor. Her face showed the lines of someone who had known real suffering. Thomas had built homes in this valley for 32 years. He had seen winters kill the unprepared. He had watched families freeze in poorly constructed cabins. And now he was watching a woman with no experience build something that defied every principle he had spent his life defending. He called out to her, "Margaret, this will not work. Metal cannot hold heat the way wood does. 2 chimneys means 2 exits for warmth to escape. You are building a coffin made of steel." Margaret looked up. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply returned to her work, adjusting the angle of the stone channel with a level she had borrowed from the rail depot. Her silence irritated Thomas more than any words could have. 3 years earlier, Margaret had survived brutal Montana winters in a traditional log cabin. Her husband James had built it in 1886 using thick Douglas fir logs sealed with clay and moss. It had a single fireplace on the north wall, the standard design everyone trusted. But trust did not keep the cold out. The winter of 1889 began like any other. November brought the first snows, and by December, the valley was locked in ice. James Hartwell was a good man, a careful builder who followed the methods his father had taught him. He cut the logs himself, fitted them tight, sealed every gap he could find. He built a firebox large enough to burn substantial logs. He did everything right. But on a night in early January, when the temperature outside dropped to 15 degrees below zero, James Hartwell lay in his bed struggling to breathe. Pneumonia had started as a simple cold 2 weeks earlier. In a warm house, it might have remained minor. In a house that could not hold heat, it became a death sentence. Margaret sat beside him through the night. She fed the fire every hour, burning 11 logs between midnight and dawn. The flames roared. The firebox glowed red. But 20 feet from the hearth, the temperature never rose above 48 degrees. Frost crept across the inside walls like a living thing. Sarah and Ruth, their daughters, slept in wool coats under piles of blankets, their breath visible in the air. James whispered through cracked lips, "This house, Maggie. I built it wrong somehow. It should be warmer than this." Margaret held his hand. "You did everything you could. This is how everyone builds." James coughed a wet sound that rattled in his chest. "What if everyone is wrong? Promise me something. If I do not make it through this, do not let the girls suffer like this. Promise me you will find a better way." At 4:17 in the morning, James Hartwell stopped breathing. Margaret sat beside his body as the fire burned low. She did not cry. She stood, walked to the door, and stepped out into the snow. 6 other cabins stood within sight, smoke thin from their chimneys, walls thick with ice. She counted them. 7 families, 7 homes built the same way, 7 households slowly freezing. She whispered into the frozen air, "We are all dying slowly, and we call it normal." By spring, Margaret had made a decision. She sold James's plow team for $240. It was everything she had. She walked to the rail depot and found the freight manager, a man named John Willis, who had known James. "I want to purchase a Quonset shed," she told him. Willis looked at her like she had asked to buy a locomotive. "Those are for equipment storage, Mrs. Hartwell." "Not for living," Margaret met his eyes. "I know what they are for. I still want to buy one." The shed arrived in April, delivered by rail. 32 feet long, 16 feet wide, made of corrugated steel shaped into an arch. When the workers unloaded it onto her property, neighbors came to watch. Some laughed, others shook their heads. A few tried to warn her that metal would freeze her solid, that the structure was never meant for people. Margaret listened to them all. She smiled. She paid the freight charges. And then she began to dig. Thomas Blackwood heard about the purchase that same week. He went to Margaret's property not to mock her, but to warn her. He had his reasons. 10 years earlier, Thomas had lost his wife Helen in a construction accident. He had designed an improved scaffolding system for a barn raising, something new that would save time and effort. The scaffold had collapsed. Helen had died instantly. Since that day, Thomas had trusted only proven methods. He built the way his father had built, the way his grandfather had built. Innovation had killed his wife. Tradition kept people alive. He found Margaret sketching diagrams on a piece of paper, measurements in angles that made no sense to him. She had borrowed 3 books from the Depot Principles of Thermodynamics, Military Field Construction Manual, and Modern Heating Systems for Cold Climates. The books lay open on a wooden crate beside her. Mrs. Hartwell Thomas said carefully, "I lost my wife because I tried something new. Do not make my mistake." Margaret looked up at him. "I lost my husband because I trusted something old, Mr. Blackwood. That was my mistake." They stood in silence, 2 people shaped by loss, holding opposite conclusions about what that loss meant. Through May and into June, Margaret worked. She hired 2 laborers to help erect the metal shell, but the design was entirely her own. She dug foundation trenches 3 feet deep to avoid frost heave. She built 2 stone chimneys, each 12 feet tall, positioned at opposite ends of the structure. Between them, she constructed something no one in the valley had seen before: horizontal stone channels that would force smoke to travel 16 feet sideways before rising vertically to exit. At night, she studied the books. The thermodynamics text explained heat transfer, conduction, radiation. The military manual showed efficient use of limited materials. The heating systems book discussed thermal mass and storage. Margaret read slowly, sometimes not understanding half of what she encountered. But she tested everything she learned. She watched her old fireplace on cool spring evenings, observing how heat moved. She noticed that warmth did not escape straight up the chimney in a simple column. When wind blew through gaps in the cabin walls, it created eddies and currents. Heat swirled, lingered it for a moment, then was pulled away. She realized something important. Heat needed time inside a structure. It needed to be captured, held, released slowly. The stone channels would do that. Hot smoke would travel through them, transferring energy into the rock. The rock would hold that heat for hours, radiating it back into the living space long after the fire had burned down. 2 separate fireboxes served different purposes: a large one for slow overnight burns, a smaller one for quick daytime heating when needed. Sarah, 14 years old and protective of her mother, came home from school one afternoon with tears in her eyes. "Mama, the children make fun of us. They say we are going to freeze to death in a metal house." Margaret set down her tools. "Do you know why I am building this?" Sarah nodded. "Because you do not want Ruth and me to die like Papa." Margaret shook her head. "Not just that. I am building this because I refuse to accept that suffering is normal. I want you to learn that lesson. When something is wrong, you do not have to accept it just because everyone else does." The Quonset shed took shape through summer. The curved steel formed the outer shell. Inside, Margaret built a second wall of wood, leaving an air gap for insulation. She raised the floor 8 inches above the ground, creating a barrier against cold seeping up from below. Every element served a calculated purpose. Thomas Blackwood stopped by regularly, always with warnings. The building inspector, Gerald Moss, came twice, citing concerns about codes and safety standards. Margaret listened to them all with the same patient silence. When Gerald pressed her about regulations, she asked him a simple question: "Can you show me which code says a widow cannot try to save her own life?" Gerald had no answer for that. By October, the structure was enclosed. Margaret moved her daughters into the strange metal home as the first hard freeze arrived. Neighbors watched with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Thin smoke rose from both chimneys. Inside, Margaret kept detailed records: temperature readings every 2 hours, wood consumption measured in pounds, observations about air movement and heat retention. The first cold snap came in late November. Outside, temperatures dropped to 5 degrees above zero. Margaret burned 8 pounds of wood per day. The interior temperature held steady at 61 degrees. 20 feet from the firebox near the curved metal wall, the temperature measured 59 degrees. The stone channels remained warm to the touch 6 hours after the fire had gone cold. Daniel Ashford, a neighbor who farmed the land adjacent to Margaret's property, burned 35 pounds of wood that same day. His traditional log cabin, well built and carefully maintained, fluctuated between 45 and 52 degrees. His 4 children wore coats indoors. Thomas Blackwood burned 42 pounds and kept his home between 48 and 55 degrees. He was a better builder than most, but even his skill could not overcome the fundamental limitations of the design everyone used. On November 15th, Thomas called a meeting at the general store. 23 people attended. Margaret was not invited, but word reached her anyway. Thomas stood before his neighbors and spoke with genuine concern in his voice. "I am not saying this out of spite. I am saying this because I do not want to see 2 children orphaned. That design will fail. Metal does not retain heat the way wood does. 2 chimneys are simply 2 holes for warmth to leak through. By Christmas, Mrs. Hartwell will have to return to her old cabin if she is still alive." 19 people agreed with him. 3 remained silent, including Daniel Ashford. One person defended Margaret Martha Green, a 67-year-old school teacher who had taught both Sarah and Ruth. "Thomas means well," Martha said quietly. "But meaning well and being right are not always the same thing." Margaret heard about the meeting that evening. She did not go to defend herself. Instead, she opened her journal and wrote in careful script, November 16th, 1891. House complete. Outside temperature 38 degrees. Inside temperature with no fire 52 degrees. 32 days until Christmas. Thomas Blackwood has bet my daughter's lives on his certainty. I have bet their lives on mathematics. One of us will have to live with the consequences. The valley settled into winter's grip. November became December. Temperatures dropped steadily. Margaret continued her observations, filling page after page with data. Sarah helped with the measurements, learning to read the thermometer, calculate consumption rates, understand the relationship between fuel and heat output. Ruth, 10 years old and less interested in numbers, simply enjoyed being warm. She drew pictures by lamplight, played with her doll near the stone wall that radiated gentle heat. She did not understand why the other children said her house was strange. To her, it was simply home. Thomas Blackwood found himself troubled by doubt. He walked past Margaret's property on December 10th, ostensibly checking his own fence line, but really looking for signs of failure. Smoke rose thin from both chimneys. Through a gap in the curtain, he glimpsed Sarah reading a book, not huddled near a fire, but sitting comfortably several feet away. He told himself it was temporary luck. The real test would come when the serious cold arrived. Montana winters were not gentle. They were brutal, unrelenting sieges that exposed every weakness in a structure. When the true blizzard came, tradition would prove itself. It always had. On December 15th, old Jessup, a farmer who had lived in the valley for 50 years, sniffed the air and made a prediction. "Big storm coming. I can smell it." Like 73. Everyone who had lived through the winter of 1873 knew what that meant. 9 days of unbroken blizzard. Temperatures that dropped so low that whiskey froze solid. Wind that screamed through the mountain passes like something alive and malicious. Families began stacking wood. Thomas Blackwood had 1,200 pounds in reserve. Daniel Ashford had 900. Margaret Hartwell had 200. Daniel's wife Ellen looked at their neighbor's modest woodpile with concern. She will not make it through a long storm with so little. Daniel stared at the strange metal house. Or she knows something we do not. Ellen gave him a sharp look. You do not actually believe that. Daniel did not answer immediately. He thought about James Hartwell, a good man who had frozen to death in a house built exactly like the one Daniel lived in. He thought about his own daughter Lily, only 3 years old, who coughed in the cold nights. He thought about the thermodynamics book he had seen on Margaret's table, full of equations he could not understand. I do not know what I believe, he said finally, but I know James did everything right and he still died. The sky darkened on December 17th. The air grew still and heavy. Animals sought shelter. Birds disappeared. Everyone who understood Montana weather recognized the signs. Margaret checked her wood supply one last time. 207 pounds. She had calculated carefully. If her numbers were correct, it would be more than enough. If she was wrong, her daughters would pay the price for her arrogance. That night, she sat with Sarah and Ruth after they had gone to bed. She smoothed Sarah's hair and spoke softly. Tomorrow or the next day a storm will come. It may last a long time. I need you both to trust me. Can you do that? Sarah, old enough to understand fear, nodded seriously. Ruth, too young to grasp the danger, simply smiled. I trust you, Mama. You made us a warm house. Margaret kissed them both. Then she sat alone in the quiet house, listening to the wind begin to rise. She opened her journal to a fresh page and wrote December 17th, 1891. Storm approaching, all preparations complete. 2 fireboxes ready, stone channels heated and tested, wood supply 207 pounds. Outside temperature, 18 degrees. Inside temperature, 64 degrees with minimal fire. In 2 days, Thomas Blackwood will either have to admit he was wrong, or I will have to admit I killed my children with pride. The winter does not care which of us is right. It only cares what works. She closed the journal and walked to the window. Across the valley, lights glowed in cabin windows. Families huddled close to their fires, preparing for the siege to come. Somewhere in one of those cabins, Thomas Blackwood was adding logs to his hearth, certain in his knowledge, confident in the tradition. Margaret placed her hand against the stone wall. It was warm, not hot, but consistently, reliably warm. She had not lit a fire in 4 hours yet. The heat remained stored in the rock, radiating back into the space where her daughter slept. She thought about James, about his final words. Promise me you will find a better way. She had kept that promise. Now winter would judge whether her way was truly better or simply different. The wind picked up. Snow began to fall. Not heavy yet, but steady, purposeful. Margaret added a small amount of wood to the overnight firebox, enough to keep the stone channels charged through the night. She used 4 pounds. In Thomas Blackwood's cabin, he would use 20 by morning. December 18th dawned gray and ominous. By noon, snow fell heavy and sideways. By sunset, the temperature had dropped to 8 degrees below zero, and the wind screamed through the Bitterroot Valley like something ancient and hungry. The Christmas siege had begun. Thomas Blackwood fed his fireplace constantly. His cabin, built with thick logs and a massive central hearth, consumed wood at a terrifying rate. He stayed awake through most of the night, adding logs every 90 minutes just to keep the interior temperature above 40 degrees. His eyes burned with exhaustion. His hands were rough from handling split wood. He looked through his frosted window toward the spot where he knew Margaret's metal house stood. Though he could see nothing through the whiteout, he prayed that he was wrong. For the first time in 10 years, Thomas Blackwood genuinely hoped his expertise had failed him. Because if he was right, 2 little girls were dying in the cold, and their blood would be on his hands for not stopping their mother more forcefully. Inside Margaret Hartwell's curved metal home, the air was calm and warm. The interior temperature held at 63 degrees. She had burned 4 pounds of wood since morning. The large firebox contained a small, steady fire that would burn through the night. The stone channels absorbed the heat and released it slowly, evenly, without drama or waste. Sarah sat reading by lamplight, not huddled near the fire, but comfortable in the middle of the room. Ruth drew pictures with crayons, occasionally looking up to ask her mother questions about clouds or snow, or why the wind sounded angry. Margaret recorded the day's data in her journal. December 18th, day 1 of storm. Wood consumed 4 pounds. Temperature range 62 to 65 degrees. Stone channel temperature, warm to touch 6 hours after last fire. No drafts, no cold spots. The house holds. She paused, pen hovering over the page, then added one more line. Thomas was wrong about the design, but he was right to care. That is the difference between us. He cares enough to resist change. I care enough to demand it. Outside, the blizzard strengthened. Snow piled against walls and buried fences. The temperature continued to fall. Across the valley, families fought for survival, burning wood as fast as they could split it, watching their children shiver despite the roaring fires. And in a metal house that everyone said would be a tomb, 2 girls slept peacefully under light blankets, warm and safe, while their mother sat awake and proved that sometimes the quietest answer is the one that survives when the storm finally ends. The storm did not pass overnight. It stayed. Snow buried fences, barns and roads. Drifts climbed higher than windows. Rail service stopped. No one could leave. Every family was trapped inside whatever shelter they had built, forced to learn very quickly whether their home was strong enough. December 19th arrived without dawn. The sky remained a uniform gray indistinguishable from the swirling snow. The temperature dropped to 18 degrees below zero. Wind found every crack, every weakness, every gap in construction that had seemed minor in autumn, but now became a pathway for death. Thomas Blackwood had not slept in 30 hours. He sat in a chair pulled close to his fireplace, feeding logs into flames that never seemed adequate. At 6 in the morning, with the fire already burning for 2 hours, his cabin registered 41 degrees. He added more wood. The temperature climbed to 43, then slowly fell back as heat rushed up the chimney and escaped into the merciless cold. He kept records too, though his were marks of desperation rather than scientific inquiry. 89 pounds of wood in 24 hours. His reserve pile, so substantial just yesterday, had diminished to 1,111 pounds. Simple arithmetic told him the terrible truth. If the storm lasted as long as old Jessup predicted, he would run out of fuel with 3 days still remaining. Thomas looked at his hands. They trembled slightly, not from cold, but from exhaustion and something deeper. Fear. Not for himself. He had lived long enough. But fear that he had condemned Margaret Hartwell and her daughters through his certainty. Fear that his public opposition had prevented others from considering her methods. Fear that his 32 years of experience meant nothing against a widow with borrowed books and desperate mathematics. He stood and walked to his frosted window. He could see nothing through the ice and snow, but he knew the direction of Margaret's house. He pressed his forehead against the frozen glass and whispered a prayer he had not spoken since Helen died. Please let me be wrong. Daniel Ashford's situation was worse. His cabin, though well-maintained, housed 6 people instead of 1. 4 children ranging from 12 years down to 3, plus himself and his wife Ellen. Body heat helped, but it also meant more breath, more moisture, more frost forming on the interior walls. His 12-year-old son Jacob wore 2 coats. His 9-year-old daughter Emma slept under 4 blankets. His 6-year-old son Michael huddled close to his older siblings. And Lily, just 3 years old, had developed a dry cough that reminded Daniel too much of the symptoms that had killed James Hartwell. Ellen wrapped Lily in another blanket, her face tight with worry. She is getting worse. Daniel added wood to the fire, watching 76 pounds of their reserve disappear in a single day. The temperature in their cabin fluctuated between 42 and 44 degrees. Never warm, never comfortable, just barely sufficient to sustain life. "How much wood do we have left?" Ellen asked, though she already knew the answer would frighten her. 824 pounds. Daniel did not meet her eyes. If the storm lasts 9 days, like Jessup said, we will need to burn less, much less. Ellen understood what that meant. Colder nights, sicker children, impossible choices about who stayed closest to the fire. Lily coughed again, a harsh sound from such a small body. Ellen pulled her daughter closer, feeling the heat of fever through the blankets. This is how Sarah Brennan died last winter. Pneumonia in a cold house. She started with a cough just like this. Daniel stood abruptly. "I'm going to check on Margaret." Ellen stared at him. "In this storm, you will die before you reach her door." Daniel pulled on his heaviest coat. "She is 200 feet away. I can make it, and I need to know. Need to know what, if she was right, if there is a better way. If James Hartwell died for nothing, or if he died because we are all too stubborn to learn." Ellen started to protest and looked at Lily, coughing in her arms. She nodded. "Be careful." Daniel opened the door into a wall of white. The wind hit him like a physical blow. Snow stung his face, blinded him, filled his lungs with ice when he tried to breathe. He could barely see 3 feet ahead, but he knew the direction. 200 feet straight west, he began to dig. The snow had drifted against Margaret's property in massive walls. Daniel used his hands, his shoulders, his entire body to burrow through. His fingers went numb within minutes. His face burned with cold. He lost track of time, lost track of distance, focused only on the next foot of progress, the next arm span of frozen barrier. 45 minutes later, his hand struck metal. The curved wall of the Quonset shed. He followed it, feeling his way along the surface until he found the door. He pounded on it with fists he could no longer feel. The door opened. Heat poured out like a wave of summer air, so unexpected and powerful that Daniel actually gasped. Margaret stood there, surprise on her face. Behind her, impossibly, Sarah sat at a table working on arithmetic problems. Ruth played with blocks near the far wall. The room glowed with lamplight and comfort. "Mr. Ashford." Margaret stepped back. "Come in quickly before you freeze." Daniel stumbled inside. The door closed behind him. Heat enveloped him like a blanket. He stood dripping snow onto the floor, staring around in disbelief. The temperature inside was 63 degrees. He could feel it. Not a guess, not an estimate, but a real measurable fact that contradicted everything he thought he knew about winter survival. His own cabin burning wood constantly never exceeded 44 degrees. This metal structure, which everyone said would be a frozen tomb, was warmer than his traditional log home by nearly 20 degrees. Sarah looked up from her schoolwork. "Hello, Mr. Ashford. Would you like some hot cocoa?" Relief, grief, and rage warred in Daniel's throat, or each emotion fighting for voice. He managed only a nod. Margaret guided him to a chair. "Sit down. You look like you have seen something impossible." Daniel sat. His eyes moved around the room, cataloging details. The fireplace contained only embers, no active flames, yet the heat remained steady, radiating from stone walls that looked almost ordinary until you touched them and felt the energy stored inside. "How much wood?" His voice came out rough. "Since yesterday morning, how much wood have you burned?" Margaret walked to a ledger on the table and opened it. 12 pounds. Daniel shook his head. "That is not possible. I burned 90 pounds. My house is still only 40 degrees. Margaret sat across from him. She did not gloat. She did not lecture. She simply pulled out a piece of paper and began to draw a diagram. "Your house burns wood to create heat. That heat rises directly up your chimney and escapes. You are fighting winter by pouring energy into it as fast as you can generate it." Her pencil sketched a traditional cabin with arrows showing heat flowing upward and out. She drew another diagram showing her curved structure. "My house burns wood to load heat into stone. The stone holds that energy and releases it slowly over 8 to 10 hours. I am not fighting winter. I am osing winter. The cold outside makes the insulation work better. The temperature difference creates the efficiency." Daniel stared at the drawings. His education had ended at age 12. He was not a stupid man, but thermodynamics and heat transfer were not part of his world. Yet the diagram made sense in a way that transcended formal knowledge. It was logical, elegant, obvious once someone showed you how to see it. "Lily is sick." The words came out before he could stop them. "My daughter, she has a fever and a cough. Ellen thinks she will die like James did." Margaret's expression softened. "What is the temperature in your house?" 39 degrees this morning. "Sometimes 41. Margaret stood decisively. "James died at 48 degrees. You need to bring your family here." Daniel looked up sharply. "What?" "Bring them here. All of them. There is room and there is heat. Lily needs to be somewhere warm, or she will get worse." "I cannot." Daniel stood as well, shame heating his face. "At the meeting when Thomas said you would die, I sat silent. I did not defend you. I did not speak up. I have no right to ask for your help." Margaret met his eyes. "You did not laugh. You did not mock. And you came here through a blizzard to check on me, even though you thought I might already be dead. That is enough." Sarah added quietly, "Mama says if we are right, we have to share, not to show off, so nobody else has to die like Papa." Daniel felt tears freeze on his face. They were already cold from the brief exposure to Margaret's door. He nodded, unable to trust his voice. It took 2 hours to move the Ashford family through the storm. Daniel dug a path, rested, dug more. Ellen carried Lily wrapped in blankets. The older children followed, holding onto rope tied between them. They moved like a human chain through the white chaos, buffeted by wind, blinded by snow, trusting only Daniel's determination and Margaret's promise of safety. When they finally stumbled through the door into Margaret's house, Emma Ashford started crying. Not from cold, but from relief so overwhelming it manifested as sobs. She had not been truly warm in weeks. None of them had. They had grown accustomed to shivering, to numb fingers, to breath visible in the air. The comfort felt like a miracle. Margaret organized the space with quiet efficiency. 8 people in a structure designed for 3. The children claimed areas near the stone walls. Ellen laid Lily on a pallet close to where the heat radiated most strongly. Within an hour, the little girl stopped shivering. Within 2 hours, her cough eased. Ellen sat on the floor beside her daughter, one hand on Lily's forehead, feeling the fever begin to break. She looked at Margaret with an expression that combined gratitude and something like despair. "I thought you were insane. At the store meeting when Thomas spoke, I agreed with him completely. I was certain you would kill your daughters with your pride." Margaret knelt beside her. "I thought I was insane too. until I saw the numbers, until I measured and tested and proved it worked. Pride did not build this house. Grief did, and refusal to accept that suffering is normal. Ellen watched Margaret add a small amount of wood to the daytime firebox, just a few pieces burning for 20 minutes. The temperature in the room, which had dipped slightly with the door opening and closing, rose from 62 degrees to 66 degrees. Ellen had watched Daniel burn entire logs for hours to achieve a temperature increase of 2 degrees. How did you learn this? Ellen's voice was barely above a whisper. Books, observation, desperation. Margaret sat back. Every night I sat feeding the fire in our old cabin. I watched how the heat moved. I asked why it had to escape so quickly. I asked why capture and storage were never considered. And I refused to accept that the answer was simply because this is how it has always been done. Ruth looked up from her drawings, puzzled by something she had just noticed. Mama, why do we not hear the wind? At the old cabin, it was so loud. Margaret smiled. Because this house has no sharp corners, sweetheart. The wind cannot push against flat walls. It slides around the curve. Sarah, listening from her corner, suddenly understood something profound. The shape itself is part of the design. Not just the chimneys. Everything works together. Exactly, Margaret said. Every element serves the whole. Ruth, barely listening to the deeper conversation, showed Lily her collection of carved, wooden animals. The two youngest children, separated by just a year in age, began to play, while the adults processed the strangeness of survival. December 20th arrived, then the 21st. The storm did not weaken. If anything, it intensified. Temperature outside plunged to 22 degrees below zero. Wind speeds increased. Snow fell in sheets so thick that daylight became gray twilight, and twilight became indistinguishable from night. Sarah kept records, now helping her mother document everything. Day 3 would consume 7 pounds. Day 4 would consume 6 pounds. Temperature consistent between 62 and 64 degrees. 10 people living comfortably in space designed for 3. The children adapted with the resilience of youth. They played games. They told stories. Jacob Ashford, 12 years old and curious, asked Margaret to explain how the stone channels worked. She drew diagrams, showed him the path of smoke, and he'd explained thermal mass in terms simple enough for a child to grasp. Jacob understood immediately. It is like a battery, he said, but for energy instead of electricity. Margaret smiled. Exactly like a battery. Daniel and Ellen watched their children laugh and play in conditions they had not experienced all winter. The contrast with their own cabin, now buried and inaccessible across 200 feet of impassable snow, could not have been more stark. On the evening of December 21st, Ellen helped Margaret prepare a simple dinner. Soup made from stored vegetables, bread baked in the smaller firebox. As they worked, Ellen spoke carefully. When this storm ends, will you teach us? Will you show Daniel how to build what you built? Margaret did not hesitate. Yes, anyone who wants to learn I will teach. But not for pride, not to prove Thomas wrong. Only so no one else loses someone they love to cold that can be defeated. Meanwhile, across the valley in his increasingly frigid cabin, Thomas Blackwood faced his own crisis. 456 pounds of wood remained. The temperature in his home had dropped to 38 degrees, the lowest he had ever experienced indoors. Frost coated the interior walls in intricate patterns that would have been beautiful if they were not harbingers of death. He sat wrapped in blankets, feeding the fire logs he could barely afford to burn, and thought about Helen, his wife, dead 10 years because he had tried to innovate, tried to improve on traditional scaffold design. The structure had collapsed. She had fallen. He had watched her die. For a decade, Thomas had believed the lesson was clear. Innovation kills, tradition protects. He had built that belief into a fortress around his heart, used it to justify his resistance, to change his mockery of anyone who dared to deviate from proven methods. But sitting alone in a freezing cabin, while a widow with no formal training kept her family warm in a metal shell, Thomas began to question everything. Helen had not died because he innovated. She had died because he had designed poorly, because he had been arrogant, had skipped steps, had trusted his instinct over calculation. Margaret Hartwell had not trusted instinct. She had borrowed engineering manuals. She had measured and tested. She had approached innovation with humility and precision. The difference was not between old and new. The difference was between reckless and rigorous. Thomas stood on unsteady legs and walked to his window. He scraped ice from the glass with numb fingers and stared out into the white chaos. He could not see Margaret's house, could not see anything but snow and wind, but he knew the direction. He made a decision. On December 22nd, Christmas Eve, Thomas Blackwood began to dig. Not to escape, not to seek shelter for himself, but to apologize. The journey took 3 hours. He was older than Daniel, less strong, more exhausted from days without sleep. But he dug with the determination of a man who had finally understood the weight of his mistakes. He dug through drifts taller than himself. He dug until his hands bled inside his gloves. He dug until he struck the curved metal wall and followed it to the door. When he knocked, he expected Margaret alone, perhaps the children. He was not prepared for what he found. The door opened. Heat rushed out, and inside stood not 3 people, but 10. Margaret and her daughters, Daniel and Ellen Ashford, and their 4 children. Martha Green, the old school teacher who had apparently made the journey on the 23rd, all of them warm, all of them safe, all of them living proof of his failure. Thomas stood in the doorway, snow covering him like a burial shroud, and looked around at the impossible scene. Children playing, adults cooking, lamplight and comfort, and a thermometer on the wall reading 64 degrees, while his own home slowly approached freezing. He looked at the fireplace. Embers only. No active fire. Yet the stone walls radiated energy he could feel from where he stood. "I was wrong," his voice cracked on the words. Margaret stepped aside. "Come in, Mr. Blackwood. You look half frozen." Thomas entered. The door closed. The heat surrounded him and he began to shake. Not from cold, but from the release of a decade of self-imposed blindness. He turned to face them all. These people whose suffering he had prolonged through his certainty. "Mrs. Hartwell, I was not just wrong about your design. I was wrong about why I opposed it. I told myself I was protecting you. But I was protecting myself. If you were right, it meant I had been wrong for 32 years. It meant the houses I built had caused unnecessary suffering. It meant my wife Helen, she might have died because I was too afraid to learn from my mistakes." His voice broke completely. He sat heavily in the chair Margaret offered. She gave him coffee, hot and strong. He wrapped his hands around the cup, feeling circulation return to his fingers. "I am sorry, not because you won, but because I cared more about being right than about people being warm." Margaret sat across from him. "I did not build this house to prove you wrong, Mr. Blackwood. I built it because I could not bear to watch my daughters die the way my husband did. If you want to learn, I will teach you. Not so you can punish yourself, but so no one else has to die in winter." Daniel placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. The old builder looked up at the younger man, saw forgiveness there, and something broke inside his chest. He wept. For the first time since Helen's death, Thomas Blackwood allowed himself to cry. Martha Green spoke softly from her corner. "Courage is not never being wrong, Thomas. Courage is admitting when you are wrong." That night, as the storm finally began to weaken, Margaret wrote in her journal, December 24th, 1891, day 7. Wood consumed 43 pounds total since storm began. 10 people alive and well. Thomas Blackwood apologized not because he lost, but because he was willing to learn. That is the real victory. Tomorrow the storm will release us, and this valley will never be the same. She closed the book and looked around at the people sleeping in her house. Children curled together, parents resting for the first time in days, an old builder who had carried his grief for a decade and finally set it down. All of them warm, all of them safe, all of them proof that sometimes the quietest answer is the one that survives when everyone else has shouted themselves into the cold. December 27th dawned clear and brilliant. The storm broke during the night, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and silence. 8 feet of accumulation buried fences and outbuildings. Drifts rose higher than doorways. The valley lay wrapped in white so pure it hurt to look at under the morning sun. Margaret opened her door to air so cold it crystallized immediately in her lungs. 25 degrees below zero. The sky stretched overhead in flawless blue, innocent and beautiful, as if the 9-day siege had never happened. But the evidence lay everywhere. In the depth of the snow, in the exhausted faces of survivors, in the wood piles reduced to splinters, and the cabins barely warm enough to sustain life. Thomas Blackwood helped Margaret and Daniel dig a path from the door. His movements were slow, stiff. From age and exhaustion, but purposeful. He had slept for 4 hours on Margaret's floor, the first real sleep he had managed in a week. When he woke, he did not speak much. He simply picked up a shovel and began to work. By mid-morning, they had cleared enough space for the door to open fully. Cold air flowed in, meeting warm air flowing out, creating visible currents in the threshold. The contrast could not have been more obvious. Inside, 63 degrees. Outside, death. Old Jessup appeared at 10 o'clock, walking with the careful steps of a man who had seen 73 winters and knew how to navigate their aftermath. He stopped at the edge of the cleared area and stared at the thin smoke rising from Margaret's dual chimneys. Then he looked at the thick, desperate smoke pouring from every other chimney in sight. His weathered face showed no expression, but his eyes held understanding. "May I come in?" "Mrs. Hartwell," Margaret gestured. "Welcome." Jessup entered, and his reaction was the same as everyone else's. A sharp intake of breath, a momentary stillness as heat surrounded him, a slow survey of the room, noting the people, the comfort, the impossible achievement of survival in the heart of Montana winter. He walked to the nearest stone wall and placed both palms against it. Warm. He nodded slowly. "I have lived here 50 years. I have never seen this." Margaret offered him coffee. He accepted, wrapping gnarled hands around the cup, and asked the question that mattered. "Who are you, Mrs. Hartwell?" "Just a woman who refused to accept that suffering is normal." Jessup smiled, the expression creasing his face into 1,000 lines. "That is who changes the world, Mrs. Hartwell. Not the loudest voice. The one who quietly refuses to accept what everyone else calls inevitable." Word spread with the speed that only small communities can achieve. By afternoon, 15 people had made the journey through snow to see Margaret's house, to measure the temperature themselves, to count the wood she had used, to touch the stone walls and feel stored heat radiating hours after the fire had burned low. The numbers told a story that could not be argued away. Margaret had consumed 103 pounds of wood over 9 days while keeping 10 people warm. Thomas Blackwood had burned 723 pounds and barely kept himself alive. Daniel Ashford, before moving his family to safety, had used 387 pounds in just 4 days. Gerald Moss, the building inspector, had consumed 681 pounds and still watched frost climb his interior walls. The mathematics were irrefutable. Margaret's design was not just better, it was revolutionary. A woman named Clara Patterson arrived carrying her 18-month-old son, Tommy. The child's lips held a faint blue tinge, despite being wrapped in multiple blankets. Clara's husband had burned 800 pounds of wood. Their cabin had never exceeded 42 degrees. Tommy had stopped crying 2 days earlier, a silence more terrifying than any scream. "Mrs. Hartwell," Clara's voice shook. "Can you help us? Can you teach my husband to build what you built?" Margaret took the child, felt his cold hands, saw the early signs of hypothermia that she recognized from the winter James died. She wrapped Tommy in a blanket that had been resting against the warm stone wall, held him close to her own body, heat, and nodded to Clara. "I will draw diagrams for your husband. You do not need to build everything new. Just add stone channels to your existing chimney. It will make a difference." Within an hour, Tommy's lips had returned to pink. He began to cry, a sound that made Clara weep with relief. A crying baby meant a living baby. Silence meant surrender. Gerald Moss arrived in the late afternoon. The building inspector carried his official ledger and a measuring tape, but his manner had changed entirely. He was not here to cite violations. He was here to learn. "Margaret, I owe you an apology. I treated building codes as sacred law, but codes are written by people, and people can be wrong." Margaret poured him coffee. "You were not wrong to care about safety, Mr. Moss. You were only wrong to think safety cannot be improved." Gerald set down his cup and opened his ledger. "I want to include your design in my official territorial report. Will you allow that? If it saves lives, I allow it. But I will not profit from it. Anyone who wants this information should have it freely." Gerald began taking measurements. He documented the stone channel dimensions. He sketched the dual chimney configuration. He noted the air gap insulation, the raised floor, the curved metal shell. He recorded temperatures at 6 different points in the room. He calculated thermal mass and heat retention coefficients using formulas Margaret had never heard of, but whose results matched her empirical observations perfectly. "This is extraordinary," he said finally. "Not just clever, extraordinary. You have solved a problem that has killed thousands of people across the territories. Margaret shook her head. I solved the problem that killed my husband. If it helps others, that is a gift. But I did not do this for glory. I did it so my daughters would not freeze. Thomas Blackwood, listening from his corner, spoke quietly. That is why it worked, Mrs. Hartwell. You were not trying to prove anything. You were trying to survive. Break builds monuments. Necessity builds solutions. Over the next 3 days, Margaret drew 23 different diagrams. Some showed full Quonset shed configurations for families willing to build new. Others detailed retrofit modifications for existing cabins. A few presented hybrid designs that combined traditional log walls with dual chimney systems and stone channel heat storage. Thomas worked beside her, learning every detail. He filled his own notebook with measurements and principles. He asked questions with the humility of a student, not the defensiveness of a master builder being corrected. At 56 years old, he was learning to see construction through entirely new eyes. I will rebuild every house I made it, he told Margaret on the third day, and I will not charge the families I failed. It is the least I can do. Margaret looked at him steadily. Charge them fairly, Mr. Blackwood. You have to live, but build them honestly. That is all anyone can ask. Daniel Ashford had found a new direction for his life. He could not return to simple farming after experiencing what proper engineering could achieve. He approached Thomas with a request that surprised them both. Teach me to build, Mr. Blackwood. I want to learn construction. I want to help make houses that keep people alive. Thomas studied the younger man. You understand it is hard work that it takes years to master. Daniel nodded. I watched my daughter nearly die because I trusted tradition over thought. I will not make that mistake again. If it takes years, I will spend years. Thomas extended his hand. Then I will teach you. Spring arrived slowly in Montana, reluctant and cold. But by March of 1892, change had taken root in the Bitterroot Valley. 17 families had either retrofitted their existing homes or built new structures using Margaret's principles. Thomas Blackwood led construction crews. Daniel Ashford worked as his apprentice, learning quickly, asking intelligent questions, understanding that building was not just carpentry, but applied physics. The results spoke with undeniable clarity. Average wood consumption across the valley dropped by 64%, while medical outcomes improved dramatically. The winter of 1892 to 1893 saw only 3 cases of pneumonia compared to 11 the year before. No one died from cold-related illness. Families that had shivered through previous winters now lived in comfortable conditions, their children playing in shirt sleeves instead of wearing coats indoors. The constant low-grade suffering that everyone had accepted as the price of frontier life simply stopped. Gerald Moss compiled his official report in early March. He titled it The Hartwell Configuration, a Case Study in Thermal Efficiency. 47 pages of documentation, diagrams, testimonials, and mathematical analysis. His conclusion recommended territorial-wide adoption of the principles Margaret had discovered. He sent the report to the governor's office and to the Territorial Engineering Board, but he also sent copies to newspapers in Helena, Butte, and Denver. Within weeks, journalists arrived to interview the widow who had defeated Winter. Margaret refused most of them. She did not like attention. She had not built her house for fame, but for survival. The reporters frustrated her with their desire for simple narratives and dramatic quotes. She wanted to talk about thermal mass and heat transfer. They wanted to talk about her courage and determination. Sarah, now 18 years old, stepped in to help. She had inherited her mother's clarity of thought, but possessed a gift for communication that Margaret lacked. Sarah could translate technical concepts into language that anyone could understand. She gave interviews. She demonstrated the principles using models Thomas had helped her build. She represented her mother's work with eloquence and precision. In April, something unexpected arrived. A letter from the United States Patent Office in Washington. An engineer there had read Gerald Moss's report and wanted Margaret to file for a patent on her heating system design. The letter explained that she could profit substantially from licensing fees as the system spread across the Western territories. Margaret read the letter twice, then set it aside. That evening, she wrote her response by lamplight. She thanked the Patent Office for their interest, but declined their offer. Her reasoning was simple and absolute. I will not require payment for people to survive. This knowledge belongs to everyone who needs it. Sarah read the letter before Margaret sealed it. Mama, you could be wealthy. You could charge just a small fee. It would be fair compensation for your work. Margaret shook her head. Your father died because we could not afford to build better. How many other families cannot afford it either? I will not profit from desperation. The knowledge is free. Sarah smiled and kissed her mother's forehead. You are extraordinary. No, I am just a woman who asked why when everyone else said how it has always been. The influence spread faster than anyone anticipated. By 1893, the story had reached 3 territories. Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming all saw adoption of what was now formally called the Hartwell configuration. Builders traveled to Bitterroot Valley specifically to study Margaret's original structure and to learn from Thomas Blackwood, who had become the foremost expert in implementing her principles. A technical journal called Western Homesteader published a feature article titled The Widow Who Defeated Winter. It included detailed illustrations and precise measurements. Copies circulated among engineers, architects, and builders across the frontier. The article changed how people thought about residential heating in cold climates. In 1894, the Colorado School of Mines invited Margaret to present a lecture on thermal engineering. She declined immediately. The thought of standing before a room of educated men, explaining concepts she had learned from desperation rather than formal study terrified her, but Sarah wanted to go. At 19, she had been studying mathematics and physics on her own, using books borrowed from every available source. She understood her mother's work not just practically, but theoretically. She could explain the thermodynamics, calculate the heat transfer coefficients, derive the formulas that proved why the design worked. Margaret agreed to let Sarah go, but only if Thomas accompanied her. The old builder and the young woman traveled to Denver together. Sarah presented the lecture. Thomas brought a scale model of the Quonset shed with cutaway sections showing the stone channels and dual chimney system. The presentation was scheduled for 1 hour. It lasted 3 with questions extending far beyond the allotted time. Professors and students alike pressed forward to examine the model, to review Sarah's calculations, to understand how a widowed homemaker with no formal training had achieved what professional engineers had missed. At the end, the Dean of Engineering approached Sarah. Miss Hartwell, we would like to offer you admission to our program, full scholarship. You have already demonstrated more practical understanding than most of our graduates. Sarah accepted. She would become the first woman to study mechanical engineering at the Colorado School of Mines, enrolling in the fall of 1894. Ruth, now 14, took a different path. She had no interest in formal engineering, but possessed her mother's observational skills and her sister's communication gifts. She began working as an assistant teacher at the Bitterroot Valley School, specializing in science education. Her first lesson plan, delivered to wide-eyed children, told the story of how her mother had refused to accept freezing as normal. By 1895, the Hartwell configuration had become a standard term in territorial building codes. 340 structures across Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming utilized the principles Margaret had discovered. Building inspectors now specifically looked for thermal mass storage and efficient chimney design. The casual acceptance of cold, drafty homes had ended. A new standard had emerged. Margaret, watching this transformation from her quiet home in Bitterroot Valley, felt something she had not expected. Not pride exactly, more like completion. James's death had demanded meaning. She had given it meaning. The suffering that had taken her husband had been transformed into knowledge that saved others. In the spring of 1896, Margaret made a decision. Her daughters were grown now. Sarah was in Colorado studying engineering. Ruth was teaching and courting a young farmer named William Pierce. The Quonset shed, which had saved their lives and changed a region, was too small for what Margaret now needed. She would build a new house, larger, more permanent, designed for the next phase of her life. But she would use the principles she had proven, and she would reuse the stone channels from the original structure. Thomas and Daniel helped her dismantle the Quonset shed. The metal shell came down in sections, but the stone channels, built with such care 5 years earlier, remained intact. Each stone had been placed with purpose, sealed with mortar, tested under the harshest conditions imaginable. They had stored and released heat through countless cycles. They had saved lives. We should keep these, Thomas said, running his hand over the warm stone. These rocks saved all of us. That is why we will use them again, Margaret replied. The new house rose through the summer of 1896. Wood frame construction, traditional in appearance but incorporating dual chimneys in the original stone channels. The rocks that had captured heat in a metal shell now performed the same service in a log structure. The principle remained unchanged: capture, store, release. Fight winter not with brute force but with patient engineering. The first test came in the winter of 1896 to 1897. Margaret's new house, twice the size of the Quonset shed, maintained an average temperature of 66 degrees and total wood consumption for the entire winter, 340 pounds. The old cabin where James had died would have consumed more than 800 pounds and still left them shivering. Sarah came home for Christmas bringing her textbooks and a professor's praise for her thesis work. Ruth brought William the young man she would marry in spring. They gathered in the warm house and Sarah asked the question that had been forming in her mind for months. Mama, do you understand what you have done? You have changed how an entire region builds homes. You have saved lives across 3 territories. You started a revolution. Margaret shook her head. I did not start anything. I just refused to accept what everyone told me was inevitable. Other people started the revolution. They were the ones brave enough to try something different. I just showed them it was possible. Thomas Blackwood, invited for Christmas dinner, raised his glass. To the woman who taught an old fool that tradition without thought is just stubbornness wearing a respectable coat. They drank to that. Then Daniel Ashford, now a skilled builder in his own right, added his own toast. To the woman who proved that the best ideas do not come from the loudest voices. They come from the people who are too busy solving problems to worry about who gets credit. Margaret felt her eyes burn with tears she would not shed. She looked around the table at the people gathered there. Her daughters, brilliant and strong. Thomas, who had learned to forgive himself. Daniel, who had found his calling. All of them warm. All of them alive. All of them proof that change was possible when necessity demanded it, and stubbornness refused to accept suffering as normal. In 1899, Sarah graduated from the Colorado School of Mines with highest honors. Her thesis, Thermal Mass Storage in Residential Architecture. A mathematical analysis was published in 3 engineering journals. It provided the theoretical framework for what her mother had discovered through observation and testing. Together, Margaret's empirical work and Sarah's mathematical proof created a complete understanding of efficient cold weather heating. Ruth married William Pierce and remained in Bitterroot Valley as a science teacher. Her curriculum included a required unit on thermal dynamics taught using her mother's house as a living laboratory. Students visited measured temperatures, calculated heat retention, and learned that innovation could come from anywhere, even from a grieving widow with no formal education, but an unwillingness to accept the unacceptable. Thomas Blackwood retired in 1899 at the age of 63. He had spent his final working years building 127 homes using Hartwell configuration principles. He wrote a book in his retirement, Practical Thermal Engineering for Frontier Construction, which became required reading for builders across the West. On the dedication page, he wrote simply, "For Helen, who taught me to dare, and Margaret, who taught me to learn." Daniel Ashford became one of the most sought-after builders in Montana Territory. He trained 14 apprentices, passing on not just construction skills, but the philosophy behind them. Build for people, not for tradition, he told his students. Ask why before you ask how. Lily Ashford, the 3-year-old, who had nearly died in the storm of 1891, grew up healthy and strong. At 11, she announced her intention to become a doctor. Her parents, remembering the conditions that had saved her life, supported her dream completely. On a winter evening in 1905, Margaret sat in her house reading by lamplight. She was 56 years old now, her hair gray, her hands marked by years of work. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 20 degrees below zero. Inside, with no fire burning, the temperature held at 67 degrees. The stone channels, now 14 years old, still performed their patient work. A knock came at the door. Margaret opened it to find a young woman she did not recognize. 28 years old, dressed in traveling clothes, carrying an engineer's case. "Mrs. Hartwell, my name is Emily Winters. I am an engineer from Oregon. I read your daughter's thesis. I came to learn from you." Margaret invited her in. Emily's reaction was the same as everyone's had been 14 years earlier. That sharp intake of breath. That moment of disbelief as heat surrounded her. That slow recognition that everything she thought she knew about winter housing was incomplete. "They say you had no formal engineering training," Emily said as Margaret poured coffee. True, I had a dead husband, two daughters I refused to let freeze, and a willingness to ask questions everyone else had stopped asking. And you changed how the entire Western frontier builds houses. Margaret handed Emily the coffee cup and sat across from her. No, I showed people that change was possible. They did the changing themselves. I just refused to accept that suffering was mandatory. Emily opened her case and pulled out a notebook. Will you teach me everything you know? Margaret smiled and stood. She walked to a shelf and retrieved a worn leather journal. The original ledger from 1891 filled with temperature readings, wood consumption calculations, observations written in her careful script. She handed it to Emily. This is everything I know. Numbers, mistakes, successes. You will do better than I did. And someone who learns from you will do better than you. That is how humanity progresses. Not through individual genius, but through shared knowledge and the refusal to accept that things cannot improve. Emily opened the journal reverently, reading the first entry, November 16th, 1891. House complete. Outside temperature 38 degrees. Inside temperature with no fire 52 degrees. She looked up at Margaret. You built this when everyone said it would fail. I built it because my husband asked me to find a better way, and because I could not bear to watch my daughters suffer what he suffered. The two women sat together as darkness fell outside and lamplight filled the warm room. Emily asked questions. Margaret answered them with the precision of someone who had learned through necessity and observation. Outside, the valley lay frozen under winter's grip, but inside 67 houses using Hartwell configuration principles, families lived in comfort their grandparents would not have believed possible. Margaret walked Emily to the door late that evening. As the younger woman prepared to leave, she turned back with one final question. Do you have any regrets, Mrs. Hartwell? Margaret considered. Only one, Monsieur. I wish I had acted sooner. James might have lived. But then she thought of Sarah, a professional engineer, changing how people understood thermal dynamics. Ruth, a teacher inspiring the next generation to question assumptions. Thomas, a man who had learned to forgive himself and had spent his final working years making amends. Daniel, a farmer's son who had become a master builder. Lily Ashford, alive and pursuing medicine. 67 families living in conditions instead of suffering. Perhaps my suffering was not meaningless, she said quietly. Perhaps it was the price of learning that change comes not from accepting tradition, but from daring to ask why not. Winter is still cold, Mrs. Hartwell, Emily observed. Margaret smiled. Yes, but we are no longer afraid of it. That is the real victory. She closed the door and returned to her chair. She opened her journal to a fresh page and wrote by lamplight. December 18th, 1905, 14 years after the storm. Ruth asked me today if I have regrets. I told her about wishing I had acted sooner to save James. But then I see what came from that pain. Sarah the engineer, Ruth the teacher, Thomas the humbled master who learned to grow, Daniel the builder, 67 warm houses in this valley. Perhaps pain is not meaningless if it teaches us to demand better. Winter is still cold, but we are no longer afraid, and that changes everything. She set down her pen and looked out the window at the frozen valley, at the smoke rising thin from chimneys, designed with care, at a world transformed by one woman's refusal to accept that suffering was the price of survival. The stone walls radiated their patient heat. The house held firm against the cold. And somewhere in the darkness, other families slept warm, because a widow had once asked a simple question, why must it be this way? The answer, it turned out, was that it did not have to be. It only required someone brave enough to imagine something better and stubborn enough to prove it could work. That was Margaret Hartwell's legacy. Not fame or wealth, but proof that one person asking why can change the world.